So I think we'll make a start. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to our event hosted by the Daniel Morgan Graduate School and Radio Free Europe, focused on Turkmenistan's COVID delusion. So it's very rare for us to have an event focused on Turkmenistan. So it's a great pleasure to be discussing the country, the situation related to COVID with three excellent panelists today. Turkmenistan is obviously the second most populous country after North Korea to not have registered any official COVID cases. So we're going to discuss what's happening in the country, the political implications, the economic implications, and the implications for the human rights situation in the country. So just sort of a few ground rules. First, we're recording this session and we'll post afterwards to social media, a recording of the event. Second, if you want to ask any questions, please do so through the chat function. We have a lot of people on the call today, and so it'll be easier for us to manage it if you put your questions, maybe as the speakers are going along, put them in the chat function, either to everyone or to the host, and we will then relay the questions to the panelists. Please keep yourself on mute, just so that there's no interference, and please keep your video off, just so that we can sort of streamline the presentation and that the panelists themselves are on the screen all the time. So with that, I'll turn over to Mehmet Tahir from Radio Free Europe, who's going to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Ed. I'm so happy that this is our second COVID-19 event involving Central Asia in a couple of days. I'm so happy about that. And also big thanks to the panel. We know that even the authorities perhaps don't believe what they are trying to make us believe in terms of the stats of corona there. So what's the update from Turkmenistan in terms of the stats of corona there, COVID-19?
Yeah, the authorities in Turkmenistan continue to claim that no COVID-19 cases were registered inside the country, but as you pointed out, no one takes these claims seriously, and people, we hear from ordinary people telling us the stories that there are a spike of illnesses with similar to COVID-19 symptoms. And one of our correspondents told me recently that in February he had a health condition related to his lungs, and his whole family had it. And at the time, doctors told him that there is a spike of deaths due to pneumonia in Turkmenistan. Of course, we cannot pinpoint and say that those were the COVID-19 cases, but given the circumstances, given the experience in other countries, we can at least seriously suspect that those were the COVID-19 cases. One of the reasons that Turkmen authorities are emboldened in their claims of no COVID-19 cases is that unfortunately, the international organizations that are present in Turkmenistan, they are supporting those claims. They are emboldening the authorities of Turkmenistan to continue to claim that nothing is wrong in Turkmenistan. We know that Turkmen authorities and the president likes to believe that everything is okay in Turkmenistan. Everything is wonderful because they live in the era of might and happiness, and even natural disasters cannot happen in Turkmenistan, as we saw recently what happened in some of the regions. Even the hurricanes shall not devastate the whole region, eastern region. So this is the situation. Authorities continue to claim, but those claims do not carry any value for like mainly for the people inside the country.
Okay, with the thank you, Farruh. I think Edward, the way we planned, our second speaker is Dr. Anceschi or Kate.
Dr. Anceschi.
Okay, Dr. Anceschi.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to speak about it. This must be the best attended event I've ever spoken to when it comes to Turkmenistan. Usually we got dozens of people. Now we got almost 100, I checked. I'm going to be quick, and I want to make a general point from where I stepped, which of course is Glasgow. I'm not being able to go on the field at the moment. COVID seems to be the event, the catalyst that is amplifying Turkmenistan current problems. So if you had something before, through COVID, social issues, political issues, economic issues, they just become more evident. And I mostly refer to, I mean, of course, health, but also the international isolation of the regime and the economy. My talk is going to be most about the latter two issues, so isolation and the economy, always trying to get to keep an eye on the public health situation. I mean, although if we believe the government, there is no such crisis. So really, let's focus on the economy for a bit, because I think that when it comes to the post-COVID economic crisis, or the economic crisis related to COVID, whatever you want to call it, we understand that the pandemic has established a new stage when it comes to the economic deterioration of Turkmenistan. So, and I think that we now seeing the conclusion of a process that started in 2009 when they opened the China pipeline. So in 2009, and of course 2009, 2014, when Russia withdrew from the Turkmen market, Turkmenistan established a context in which you were selling pretty much the only product you have, which is natural gas, to one customer. That's the best situation. Situation becomes worse when the only customer to which you're selling your only product start not to pay because of the paper purchase agreement. And we see that China has not been paying in full the gas that they have been traded with Turkmenistan. COVID, and also the fact that we're now entering a more or less sustained era of low oil prices, is the disaster scenario. Because we have one customer who's not only not paying for your only projects, may invoke the force majeure clause of your contract, which means suspension of gas trade. And even if you manage to sell gas to a new country, to China, or to some other customers, well, the prices are low. Last week in Europe, we heard that there were $35 for 1,000 cubic meters. Well, in the golden age, not the golden age of Bedi Mohammed, of the era of high prices, we did have those prices going up at $400 US. So this is a significant kind of decrease. This is obviously not just about the prices. We heard the OECD reporting that in the last 4 to 5 months of 2020 of this year, we got a decrease of 22% in total trade between Turkmenistan and China. You would realize that in the context in which I described before, which is the one of a Chinese monopoly being the only customer, this is disastrous kind of figures. But also, this is not just about, obviously, the big issues and the big picture gas geopolitics. It's got a very significant impact when it comes to the social condition of Turkmen population. And I think that we have the COVID situation, the COVID crisis generating, beyond, of course, its public health implication, also a new era in which the relationship between state and society in Turkmenistan becomes more, if you want, problematic. So in 2014 and 15, when the government abolished the extensive subsidy system that was part of the Niazovis project, the kind of energy social pact, the social pact between the regime and the population changed significantly, because they they lost access to all this kind of easy, free of charge commodities and services that they had before. But what we see now, we see a new development, in fact, a new deterioration in the kind of accountability that the regime has got in terms of the population. And here, I think that the example that we've seen of the government imposing that the charity that was kind of donated to the people in to help the citizens in the eastern part of Turkmenistan where the storm hit has been centralized without really telling the population how this money will be kind of used. It shows to me not only a new level of kleptocracy, because this is not even about managing transparently the gas reserves, this is about managing transparently charity. This kind of new situation really creates a new total disregard for accountability when it comes to state-society relationship in Turkmenistan. Now, my last point, I want to sort of illustrate a few thoughts on my idea as to why Turkmenistan is not, is not reporting any case. When it comes to Turkmenistan, we are always kind of stuck into this narrative about, the regime is eccentric because that's how they are. And I think that we miss a lot of the point when it comes to really looking into the dynamics of political interpretation of what is actually going on in Ashgabat. So my interpretation is that what we're seeing here is that on the one hand, we have the government not reporting any case, which of course is unrealistic. We can't really trust them. But on the other hand, they're saying that they are able to increment their test capacity on a daily basis, which is kind of a contradiction because you either have the COVID or you don't. You can't have it just when it becomes to show success, which is exactly what they do. And what we see now, to me, is the new production of discourses, if you want, of regime glorification. We are the people who are impeding Turkmenistan to getting Turkmenistan to get sick as the counterpart in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, or even more Iran. And because if you want, the control of information flows allows the people in Ashgabat to depict a success which is unrealistic. And I'm sure that the people are aware of that, but nonetheless, this is what it's happening. And it reminds me very much of the situation that we've seen a few years back when it came to the HIV crisis in Turkmenistan, where the government never admitted that there were crises of HIV. They always say that the country is free from that kind of illness in that sense. And how this is possible? It's possible not only because we have seen that we know that there is a regime media monopoly, but also because we have increased isolation. I mean, Médecins Sans Frontières withdrew from Turkmenistan in 2009. We still haven't had in this context some kind of significant contribution by the World Health Organization so far as controlling what's going on in the country. So isolation in that sense, and that goes back to my initial point, is another regime dynamics that was enhanced by the COVID crisis. So my last point, COVID is the new front line in the myth of self-sufficiency that we've seen in Turkmenistan in the last 10 years. And that, of course, relates to the import substitution rhetoric we've seen in the past, more recently about agricultural products, to being autarkic in terms of agricultural development, which reprises Niaz of Naboyesielo and that kind of stuff from the early 90s. Health is the last stage in this self-sufficiency myth. I mean, unfortunately, the victim of all of this is the population who's having their rights to health kind of disregarded by the government to create another authoritarian fantasy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anceschi. I think with this, we will go to Kate, and then we will open up the floor for everyone to have a kind of informal and interactive discussion with our speakers today. Kate?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. And it is extraordinary to see so many people interested in Turkmenistan. I'm going to talk about the connection with COVID and human rights, and I have to agree with really pretty much everything that has been said by the speakers who went before me. And I think there are sort of two issues that I want to address, or two aspects of kind of the same issue in my comments today. And this is this precisely what was talked about earlier, this absolute denial by the Turkmen government that there's a problem, and the human rights implications of this extremely dangerous stance and position, which denies people not only the right to health, which is the basic human right, but also access to the information that would allow them to begin to protect their families and stay safe, especially with the absence of government assistance and government control, which we've already seen is lacking. So I want to look at it from sort of two perspectives. First, to talk about what's actually going on inside the country from our sources, the best that we can piece together, understanding that information is sparse and we don't have the luxury of oftentimes being able to sort of double, triple check information that we receive from Turkmenistan. And I think this is one of the difficulties in terms of both the isolation of the country and also our inability to kind of hold the Turkmen government to account. And oftentimes is we're not able to go in and check ourselves. And then the second piece of that is the role of international institutions, which Farruh mentioned a little bit in the beginning, and sort of complicity in this silence on the part of the Turkmen government. So, I mean, as has been said, the Turkmen government has denied the existence of COVID inside the country, but they've behaved in this sort of very confusing manner. On the one hand, saying there are no COVID cases, on the other hand, closing the borders to international flights, setting up quarantine zones around the country, and then, as far as we understand, sort of in mid-March, refusing to allow non-Turkmens who have residency permits inside the country to come back into the country with no documentation, no explanation, just sort of you can't come in. We also know that the conditions in the quarantine zones are less than ideal, particularly if the purpose of those zones is to limit exposure to disease. Putting people in tents, quarantined for 14 or up to 28 days is certainly not a way to limit the spread of disease. Secondly, we know that masks have been forbidden in public. There's never been an official decree, adding to, again, the confusion. But those individuals who have been seen or caught wearing masks in public have been taken in and fined and charged with disrupting the peace, sort of disrupting public order. We've also heard cases of people on public transportation being eavesdropped on, and if they're caught speaking about COVID, they're also taken in and fined with the same charges of disrupting the public order and given a lecture about you're not causing panic in the public. So this sort of very confusing message. On the one hand, we don't have any COVID here, but so don't wear a mask, don't talk about it, no social distancing measures, no information, but at the same time, we're going to close the borders. And I'll just mention this, maybe we can talk about it more during the Q&A, but we've also heard reports that since the first border that was closed was Iran, there's been the closure of a lot of consumer goods coming in, which is exacerbating the social situation, the social problems and the poverty and hunger that was mentioned earlier. So it's the COVID situation is sort of impacting all of these other areas of society as well. The media, which as we know is completely controlled in Turkmenistan, has not mentioned COVID and has greatly limited access to information about what's happening in Turkey, whereas we know there's a very large Turkmen diaspora. People are concerned about what's happening with Turkmen citizens in that country and what's happening with COVID in Turkey, and there's very little access to that information. The other thing that we've heard is that there has been a lot of pressure on VPN traffic of people who are trying to communicate with their relatives who are outside of the country. Again, creating a lack of information and a lack of access, further isolation of the country, which only then feeds fear and information in this absence of information. We've heard cases of arbitrary restriction of movement inside the country. Again, nothing official, nothing written down, but sometimes when people are trying to move from Belayat to Belayat, they're stopped. Other times they make it through, other times they don't. So again, this inability to understand what the ramifications are for certain types of behavior and an absolute lack of clarity. We've heard that there have been no visits to prisons since about the middle of March. Again, further isolating those who are imprisoned, most likely in very dangerous situation for those who are at risk of COVID. We understand the situation inside Turkmen prisons with regard to tuberculosis and other diseases, communicable diseases, is horrific. And that the overall conditions in prisons are pretty bad within Turkmenistan. We also understand, particularly in prisons like Obadan-Depeh, where there are political prisoners, that isolation has been ongoing, but even the little bit of opening up that has happened has stopped. And so the situation inside the country is, as both of the other speakers have said, one in which there's further isolation, further confusion, less responsibility by the government. And I think this is part of the reason why we're seeing finally some semblance of public protest inside. Is this the tipping point? We don't know, but this is certainly getting right down to it: food, health, water, sanitary conditions, those things. I mean, that's pretty much the basic stuff. And I want to turn just for a moment to the international piece of this. And I think we've all seen the reports about the World Health Organization and the United Nations lack of, I would say, responsible response to what's happening in Turkmenistan, and taking a very sort of bureaucratic stance of saying, well, the data that we've been given indicate that there are no COVID cases, and this is the way we behave in this type of regime, and so we need to go forward with that information, rather than really questioning the legitimacy of that type of a stance in a world where, you know, the number of COVID cases and deaths is going up everywhere. So I think, again, we're in a situation where the international community could do so much more to push the situation forward, to help the citizens of Turkmenistan, to demand accountability from an authoritarian regime that has indicated over and over again that the human rights of its citizens are not something that it cares about or worries about or tries to protect. So, you know, I think we're in an extremely volatile situation right now, and it's going to be quite interesting to see how we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate Waters. And you guys nicely set the scene for a broader conversation today, and we are going to jump into the broader conversation very soon. So it was also interesting that Turkmenistan denying COVID-19 was kind of consistent theme in all of your remarks, and that kind of reminds us another country from the region, which is Tajikistan, where like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan has been denying the existence of COVID-19 for a while, and it looks like Tajikistan, Turkmenistan is also blaming pneumonia for some of the recent deaths. And like in Tajikistan, as Farruh mentioned earlier, some of the representatives of the international community is kind of jumping up to validate Turkmenistan's messaging, which is kind of very interesting. On that, I will just ask one more question, and then I will hand over to Edward to lead the conversation from there. So Farruh, it is very clear that Turkmenistan has been a difficult country to report about, and they are restricting the information even further during the COVID-19 situation there. So when your reporters speak to people there on the ground, what they say, what the people talk about in terms of the existence of COVID-19 or the possibilities of existence of COVID-19 in Turkmenistan, what they know, what they hear, and where they hear those information from.
Yeah, I would like to make not a correction but a remark about blaming pneumonia. Turkmen authorities do not even mention pneumonia or any other respiratory infections, because what we hear is that the medical personnel is told not to mention pneumonia or not to mention any flu or anything that's causing any widespread situation. So it's, while it's not it's denying that COVID penetrated the territory of Turkmenistan, it's also being very careful about registering the acute respiratory infections. When it comes to reporting, of course, it's very difficult to report from the country where our reporters are forced to go undercover. They cannot report with their own names, with their own voices. But in Turkmenistan, as is in any with any situation or with any circumstance, COVID-19 situation became another possibility for corruption, for bribery. Like as Kate already mentioned, there is a restriction between of movement between the regions of the country, and people have to get what they call spravka, the certificates, health certificate, and to get those health certificates, people are paying, and people have to move between the regions given the economic circumstances at the moment. They don't have. There is a severe food shortage. Of course, we are talking about the subsidized food in the so-called state stores. They don't have this basic staples as flour, vegetable oil, so they have to travel to different regions in search of those staples, and for that they have to get those health certificates, and those health certificates become a subject for a tool for corruption. Another opportunity for the corruption is the post between the regions. Police already are threatening people to put them into quarantine if they found out that there's a high temperature in a passenger or in the driver of the car, and then they extort bribes from them. So, as is the case in other spheres, the system in Turkmenistan allowed the COVID restrictions or counter COVID measures become a tool for bribery. And we also reported about the cases when people were threatened by being fired from their jobs or being arrested when they were discussing the possibility of COVID symptoms. They were told, do not even mention coronavirus. That will get you in trouble. So this is a very difficult country, and it becomes even more difficult when the regime, the authorities want to be secretive and want to paint a pink picture of how wonderful things are inside the country without any any unfortunate events that might take place.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Farruh. So we have our first question from the audience, and that's related to the sort of situation with healthcare within the country. You know, can anyone sort of on the panel give an overview of the sort of healthcare system, the number of ventilators in the country, or at least an estimate, you know, the extent to which, you know, hospital beds are available, you know, how equipped is Turkmenistan to deal with a potential outbreak? We've obviously seen in sort of Tajikistan the healthcare system being overwhelmed, you know, the product of a lack of investment within the healthcare sector from, you know, what is a very kleptocratic regime. Are we seeing similar dynamics in Turkmenistan? So if anyone on the panel wants to take that question, or a number of you can.
I may take this question. It's very difficult to estimate how many beds are available for, well, like possible potential COVID-19 patients, or how many ventilators, because they don't give that kind of statistics. In Turkmenistan, they have this sample or show off state-of-the-art clinics, which is not available for ordinary people. They have, they show these clinics when someone from, let's say, an international organization like WHO or some other UN organization comes, and they will take them for the tour. But for the ordinary people, those clinics are not accessible at all. Ordinary people go to to run-down clinics, and we in recent 6 months we reported about the clinics with no floors or leaking ceilings. So it's very difficult to say how many, how prepared Turkmenistan is and how it's employing its resources in order to treat or hospitalize the COVID-19 patients. But we reported about the quarantine zones where the conditions are dire. Like those tents that they put out in the desert areas near Turkmenabad and in Balkanabad, near Balkanabad, they don't usually have sanitary facilities. They don't have air conditioning, which is very crucial in Turkmenistan. And there is one decent, as far as we know, one decent place as a quarantine zone, which is in Ashgabat. This is infectious diseases hospital, right on outskirts of Ashgabat, where they keep quarantine people. And there were some people with connections, let's say, that were hospitalized after they showed some symptoms. Of course, we could not verify this information with the authorities, who always deny or refuse or don't want to talk with us. But that's the only decent quarantine zone that's existent in Turkmenistan. The rest, that's in Turkmenabad and in Balkanabad, and there is one in Mari. We don't have any possibility to check how the conditions are, but what we hear, the conditions are dire. They don't get proper food, they don't get proper sanitary facilities, etc., etc. So this is how the situation is. And of course, we can with certainty say that probably Turkmenistan doesn't have enough ventilators, because they were not expecting that there would be such a situation.
I just wanted to add one small point, which is, you know, I think it's really important to remember that the World Health Organization was not allowed into Turkmenistan. And if it had been, we might have access to exactly this type of information. And it's, you know, from some of our sources, the speculation is that the Turkmen government simply couldn't tolerate the presence of the World Health Organization, given the circumstances of the medical system right now, and that's part of the reason that they didn't come in. So that's part, you know, I think that's one of the huge omissions, getting back again to our very first point, which is this isolation and lack of information that would keep people safe.
Yeah, the government of Turkmenistan, I think, is trying to buy time as regards to the WHO mission. We contacted WHO in Copenhagen. They said that they are still in negotiation, and since WHO Europe official announced possible trip to Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, they already finished their mission in Tajikistan, by the way. Turkmenistan promised, I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rashid Meredov, promised 3 times that they will be allowed, but that didn't happen yet. And there were a few explanations to that, why Turkmenistan is trying to buy time. One is that they are hoping that maybe WHO will forget about it and will just drop that idea altogether. Another one was that the main quarantine zone is located in Turkmenabad, which was hit by this devastating hurricane on April 27th, and Turkmen authorities did not want international experts to come to a town that was basically swept away by this natural disaster, which, according to how Turkmen authorities are behaving, never happened. So maybe they are trying to fix everything before they can allow someone to the main quarantine zone in Turkmenistan. But the head of the WHO in Turkmenistan visited that quarantine zone in Turkmenabad after this hurricane, but she never mentioned what she saw there. But what she only had to say was that Turkmenistan is doing everything possible to counter COVID, without saying if the COVID cases existed in Turkmenistan. And what we heard just before her visit to Turkmenabad, the dozens, if not hundreds, of quarantine people were moved out of that quarantine zone. And when she arrived there were only a dozen or 2 dozen people present there. And they, of course, were not diagnosed with COVID-19. And I would suspect that those people were just the actors who were brought to act like they were quarantine in Turkmenistan. But this kind of behavior, of course, from the international organizations like WHO or OSCE or other UN organizations in Turkmenistan, which turn a blind eye, embolden Turkmen authorities to continue to claim that COVID-19 cannot happen in Turkmenistan.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you both. So we have a number of questions coming in now, and sort of related to what we've just been speaking about. How have sort of the Turkmen authorities been capable of hiding COVID? You know, what we saw in Tajikistan, which is, I guess, the closest comparison case we have in the region, obviously, is that the first suspicious deaths were reported by Radio Free Europe, by Radio Azadi, the Tajik service, and then they were swiftly sort of denied and blocked and blamed on pneumonia. We also saw a number of sort of other suspicious deaths, videos of burials taking place with people with protective wear taking the coffin to the burial site. Have we seen any evidence from Turkmenistan of these sort of suspicious deaths that would point to COVID already being in the country?
Yeah, I mean, the first 2 cases that the Radio Free Europe's Turkmen service reported were on March 3rd. On March 3rd, we reported at least 2 two cases of COVID-19, which were of two people which were diagnosed, which were tested positive for COVID-19, were held in this infectious diseases hospital outside Ashgabat. Of course, we contacted the administration of that hospital, and they denied. They said, yes, we have hundreds of people under quarantine, but we don't have anyone who tested positive. And then we had, after that, in mid-March, we had several cases. We could not verify the exact number in Balkan region, which and along the border with Iran. There were apparently people who were in touch with some family members on the Iranian side, and they got COVID-19. And then early April, we also reported about at least 10 cases of people who were brought back from Azerbaijan on a ferry on the Caspian region, on the Caspian town, in the Caspian town of Turkmenabad, Balkanabad, and doctors from the quarantine zone in Turkmenabad were brought to deal with those patients. There were at least 10 people on that ferry. So we already reported about dozens of cases, and we verified them with independent sources close to the doctors who deal with the quarantine zones and with people who showed the symptoms and who tested positive. Of course, the authorities will deny it, and we reached out to authorities too, of course, and they say, no, we don't have any COVID-19 cases. And as I already said, like this kind of negative things cannot happen in Turkmenistan, but especially when it comes to healthcare crisis, because as we know, the president of Turkmenistan has a medical background, and he takes this kind of situations or this kind of crisis as a personal matter, as a personal failure. That's why this is one of the main reasons that they are denying vehemently that COVID-19 cannot take place or cannot penetrate the borders of Turkmenistan.
Thank you for. So I think this is a question maybe that Luca's best placed to answer, and this is sort of how Turkmenistan is using its sort of situation or claim to be COVID-free as a sort of propaganda tool internationally. I was reading this morning that Turkmenistan is setting up testing centers on the border with Afghanistan as a sort of way to serve the population of Afghanistan. So the extent to which Turkmenistan, both internally and externally, is using this idea that it's an island in a sea of coronavirus to sort of prove its sort of status as sort of as the golden century, and sort of how does it play into the regime propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, I want to also follow up with what Farruh was saying before, try to put it all together. I mean, times of crisis appear to be the perfect moment for the government to test their strategies of authoritarian management of the media. So when you have such kind of one-dimension media control of the media flow, so the information flow across the country, you can not only not tell people about things which have happened, but you can also tell people about things which didn't really happen. So you can create an artificial reality that has got at its epicenter the glorification of the regime and who is supervising the situation. So to me, both the fact that Turkmenistan is COVID-free and the dissemination of news that talk about this capacity of either testing the citizens or to help Afghanistan, which is always, the most convenient neighbors to have, because you can help them pretty much rebuild to whatever happens there. are part of the same narrative. And this narrative, of course, has to be nurtured in an environment in which there is only one voice that matters, and that's the voice of the regime. And the fact that the great majority of the media is controlled by them, it allows them to do. But it's also have got this kind of constant, persistent trajectory of bringing the people who are in power in Ashgabat on a pedestal that allows the dissemination of this idea that things are fine because they are there. I think that compared with the past, the international kind of resonance of this narrative is less kind of, if you want, we stopped listening a long while ago because we know that it is kind of empty. Regardless of the reaction that international organizations can have to this kind of news, we know that this kind of situation, and I'm referring especially to this Afghanistan propaganda bit, are for domestic consumption or for elite glorification. The reality is that we are seeing an unprecedentedly isolated regime that is ruling over a collapsing economy. So this is the reality that we see from the outside. And the distortion of this reality is what this media control context can actually do internally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luca. We also have a sort of question that's more on a logistical side, which is if international flights are obviously not taking place, how are international organizations operating? And sort of a related question is, is Turkmenistan receiving sort of medical supplies from places like China in the way that some of the neighboring Central Asian countries are? So sort of how are logistics and supply chains to the country working?
The officials are saying there are official reports citing the president of Turkmenistan and the Minister of Health of Turkmenistan saying that we're buying 40,000 of tests from China, we are getting 30,000 COVID tests from Russia, etc., etc. But on the other hand, to show that, to support their claims of no COVID-19 cases in Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan recently sent a humanitarian aid to Russia's Astrakhan Oblast, who, according to Turkmen authorities, is economically suffering due to COVID-19 restrictions there. So in this way, they are showing that they are in the capacity of even helping other countries with COVID-19. And the recent rhetoric was so funny and so trolling by Turkmen authorities, saying that Turkmenistan is ready to help international community with its experience to counter COVID-19 pandemic and to fix ailing a global economy due to COVID-19. So it's like they are really. It might sound funny for the outsiders, but it's not funny for the people of Turkmenistan who are suffering and who are very angry at the government that is not helping its own people but sending humanitarian aid to Russia, they're sending humanitarian aid to Afghanistan or Pakistan as under the rhetoric of helping those countries because they are suffering due to COVID-19.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think we have two questions related to
Edward, can I follow up with Farruh?
Please do.
Farruh, you were saying like people are angry. So we have seen two examples of that in a couple of days. One protest taking place in Mari, the other one taking place in Labab province. So it is not happening in one province, but already in two provinces. I was just wondering how serious is this development and what we can expect going forward?
Yeah, I mean, if we take it as unprecedented for Turkmenistan, and we've seen more protests in the last month than we saw protests in the 29 years of independence of Turkmenistan. From that point of view, that's I think significant, at least, and I think the Turkmen regime perceives it as a significant and serious, and those protests were put out, and people were punished. The people were questioned, and it's not only two. There were at least four, I think, which we were able to confirm. I don't know how it's going to be. I mean, it will depend. It will depend on how far the people, or how difficult it is for people, and how far they are ready to go, and how far is the regime ready to take measures against those kind of protests. But yes, the people were angry that the government is helping Russia's Astrakhan Oblast due to COVID-19, but it's not helping its own people who cannot buy simple bread and flour and vegetable oils. And there was one case when in Dashov's region, when the local governor, district governor, was almost attacked by a group of women who said that it's your fault. You told us to grow cotton, but not wheat, and now we don't have anything to eat. So it's quite significant.
Excellent. Well, I think we can follow up on the sort of seriousness of the situation and maybe sort of how things are going to develop in some of like the final questions. But before we move sort of back to that theme, which I think is very important, we have two questions that are sort of related to the role of international organizations, particularly the World Health Organization that's been mentioned a number of times on the panel. And so I think Kate's probably best placed to answer this one first, and then the other two can sort of jump in. And that's sort of, you know, why is the World Health Organization acting so cautiously in terms of not taking a more sort of active role in not criticizing the government, but certainly asking for greater transparency. And sort of the second follow-on question from a different participant was sort of what can international organizations do to pressurize the Turkmen government to increase its transparency? So what sort of, you know, it's obviously a very difficult thing to do, but what sort of opportunities does the international community have to use this situation as a way to put pressure on the government?
Thank you for that. I'll do my best. I don't know why the World Health Organization acts the way it does in this situation, but I can offer some thoughts about the overall environment in which these international institutions are operating, and some of the arguments that we've heard from other institutions. I haven't spoken directly with the World Health Organization. Farruh might have some other ideas. But I think many of these institutions are interested in engaging with Turkmenistan. And the argument we hear over and over again is if we're too confrontational, if we call them out too directly, we yell at them, the relationship will be damaged, permanently destroyed, and we won't have an end. And is that better than some sort of limited engagement? And that's sort of the argumentation that we see from most of the international institutions that engage with Turkmenistan and other countries with that sort of regime. In terms of what international institutions can do, I think they can hold the governments accountable. They can ask the tough questions. They can put, maybe sanctions is not exactly the right word, but they can put conditionalities on engagement. The European Union, the international financial institutions, individual governments can say, if you want this sort of assistance from us, if you want this sort of engagement, if you want this sort of international recognition, we demand at least this, sort of this level of compliance with international human rights obligations. And I think this is one of the points that's really important, is that if Turkmenistan wants to be part of the global community, it clearly does, if it's telling the world that it can, sort of provide assistance and advice on how to survive COVID from its expertise and experience, then Turkmenistan needs to abide by the international obligations that it's signed on to. As a member of the, if you're part of the United Nations, then you have minimal human rights obligations. If you're part of the OSCE, there's a covenant that you have agreed to. If you're part of these big international organizations, you don't just get to put that on your resume and go home and say, yay. And what we see over and over again is a failure of international organizations to say, excuse me, but you have 121 disappeared people in your prisons that you deny. You have most likely got COVID cases in your country and you're hiding that. You're not taking care of your people. You're violating the norms of international discourse and behavior and human rights standards. And so to hold a tougher line, to actually behave in a way that's in keeping with the standards that we claim to hold dear.
Perfect, thank you. And if I can just do a quick follow-up that maybe Luca and Farruh may know the answer to, but to what extent is Turkmenistan looking to Western financial institutions, the IMF, for some sort of potential bailout? We already knew that the country was probably in its worst economic crisis last year before COVID-19 and the fall in gas prices occurred. So, to what extent are we going to see Turkmenistan becoming more reliant on external funding? Or is it going to, as it probably has in the past, go to the Gulf, go to China, and countries where perhaps, the same conditionalities won't be attached to the financial support? I don't know if Luca, you want to go first then, Farruh?
Yeah, I'll leave Farruh the comment on the IMF, but I want to, it's not that I want to contradict the prior speaker, but the reality is that engagement hasn't worked. Engagement hasn't worked because the one that we have in Ashgabat is an intractable regime that is very happy not to comply with the obligation that it signs up to. And the reality is that if you look at the record, which I've done in my research, and how they comply with UN conventions, they never report. Have a look on the other hand, and they have to, because that's part of the treaty and convention they signed to. Have a look at the regularity with which they, on the other hand, comply with the Kyoto Protocol, which is before the Paris Accord. They reported every year, even though they weren't supposed to. So they are really selective, the rules of engagement. So as far as I'm concerned, and I've been looking at this for 15 years, there is not much pressure that you can put on, whether you are the WHO or the whatever it is. It was difficult for the OSCE. Even sub-regional organizations like CIS or the Russians-led organization have no pull factor in Turkmenistan, which it is a function of the policy of isolation, insulation, neutrality, impermeability, whatever you want to call it, but that's exactly the position where they want to be. Before I gave the floor to Farruh, regardless of whether or not there is a possibility that the IMF will bail them out, that would be another situation for kleptocratic authoritarianism. The funds that they will receive will not be properly managed. This is pretty sure. The way in which Turkmenistan manages its gas reserves is very similar to what the Gulf states used to do almost 100 years ago. We don't know where the money goes. So what is the context in which we were going to follow up on this money that would be given by the IMF? So yes, on the other hand, the intention could be to support the economy in reverting the declining trend. But in reality, the situation would be that that money would be another instrument of authoritarian strengthening, if you want.
Should I?
Yep.
External help. Yes, it will, and it already is. From the source information, we know that Turkmenistan already has been requesting considerable funds from IMF, and IMF. And by the way, the IMF's response to it was quite, I think, responsible, because IMF, unlike WHO or UN, has been more vocal about the situation in Turkmenistan. Their recommendations from November last year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, were that Turkmenistan has to implement serious economic reforms, including the convertibility of manat, and take austerity measures, and abandon the ideas of this useless construction projects in Ashgabat and elsewhere in the country. And I think IMF has put some conditions that Ashgabat, official Ashgabat, has not yet shown inclination to follow, but I think it will be forced to follow. And another example of how Turkmenistan failed to get some help for the COVID-19 related situation was that EU allocated millions of euros to all the countries in the world, and to Central Asian countries. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan got tens of millions of euros to counter COVID crisis. But Turkmenistan was not given that fund because Turkmenistan's data is so corrupted, is so far from the reality that by the EU's standards, Turkmenistan has more than enough of internal resources. So that was one of the failures. And I would like to add to what Kate and Luca was saying about how this so-called engagement by these organizations that are present in Turkmenistan is counter-effective, because every time that you visit these state-organized events and clap and dance to the songs of the president of the country, and hail him and praise him as a talented genius, the more you do harm, the more you lose the opportunity to engage on your own terms or on the mutual respectful terms. Then you give your ground and you give in to the terms of the regime, to the dictation of the regime, that they will dictate you how you want to engage. There was one example during this crisis. It was very minor, which got under the skin of the regime, when the US embassy puts out this alerts messages. It said, we recommend that you don't travel to Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan did not register any COVID-19 cases, but it might be disinclined to do so, even if there were cases. It got under the skin of the regime that they almost started a war of words. They were saying, United States never helped us. We always paid for any technical assistance that the United States was providing, and so on and so forth. So it's like when you behave in a way that you agree and you praise the Turkmen government as like Turkmenistan is contributing to the world development, they will become so spoiled, so emboldened that even a minor remark, a minor comment will get under their skin, and they will start behaving in counter-effective way.
Perfect, thank you. Maybe Kate, you want to have a follow-up on that point, just quickly?
I mean, I mean, I just agree with what Farruh has said, and I think it's really critical to understand that when we, the West, play along, we are playing into the hands of authoritarians. And, you know, money matters, opinions matter, and they are that government is very keen to be seen as respectable in the international arena. And as long as international governments behave in a sort of polite, diplomatic way to allow that to happen, they're undermining, I believe, what are our stated objectives and goals with regards to human rights and civil rights in that country. So you can't really have it both ways.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And then we have a related question that's sort of looking beyond the West to sort of rising China and sort of resurgent Russia, two of Turkmenistan's most important partners. To what extent can you comment on the reception of Turkmenistan's COVID-free status in both of those countries? Do we have a sense if Russia and China believe the narrative? Are they putting out any statements that are sort of at least sort of acceding to the possibility that there's no COVID in the country? Are they supporting the government at this time?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think that neither of those countries believe that. Yeah, I don't believe that there were any statements or any comments from China or Russia about COVID-free Turkmenistan. But in Russian media, not the state-controlled media, but independent websites and independent TV channels, they had reports saying that how the Turkmenistan is banning the word coronavirus. They were criticizing, of course, the situation, and for the Russian media, it has become a topic for mocking the situation in Turkmenistan, how Turkmen government banned coronavirus from entering Turkmenistan. But I don't think that the officials, the governments of those countries would believe anything, not only about COVID-19 situation, but anything that comes out of the mouth of the government of Turkmenistan.
Perfect. And we have three more questions, the first of which is related to the diaspora. We've obviously seen in some of the other Central Asian countries, the diaspora being a sort of key source of support, raising money to buy PPE. What role are we seeing the sort of Turkmen diaspora playing within this crisis?
As it comes to COVID-19, at least I don't know of any fundraising to help buy PPE or to help like COVID-19 related situation in Turkmenistan, because Turkmen government will not allow it. But there was recently there were several campaigns to raise money for the regions that were hit by this hurricane on April 27th. In one case, Turkmenistanis or Turkmen migrants in the United States, they raised $5,000 to be distributed to people in the Lebap region, and Turkmen police came to their contact person in Turkmenabad and threatened him with jail if he receives that money and distributes it to people in Lebap. Moreover, in Lebap, those people who sustained damages to their houses, who are suffering, they were called for questioning when they when they tried to fix their houses and bought some construction materials. They were called for questioning about where they got money, whether they received that financial aid from anyone outside the countries.
Thank you, Farruh. And so the next question is related to the sort of economic crisis. To what extent, this maybe Luca can answer, to how deep is this economic crisis going to be for Turkmenistan? We've already seen China obviously using its force majeure on certain contracts, and even before COVID, already the demand in China for gas was falling. So how bad is this going to get for Turkmenistan?
Well, I think that the crisis is pretty much COVID unrelated. I mean, things would have been bad even without the COVID, because it is structural. This is a country that is experiencing the failure of its whole entire model of economic development for the last 30 years. It is very unsustainable to have that kind of rentier situation in which the whole economy is predicated upon the export of one single resource. So COVID, of course, will complicate the international environment in which this kind of Turkmen gas rentierism operates. It will complicate the access because of fewer financing availability to from China or from other potential customers everywhere. Of course, it will limit, if that was ever the case, the possibility of building new pipeline. But the crisis was there before COVID, and as far as I see it will be there even when the effects of the pandemic are gone, because it is structural. It's connected to the fact that we've had a single regime thinking only in terms of extracting money from the gas reserves. It is there to stay. So in that sense, we could have a temporary further deterioration of the situation due to the pandemic. But unless they, as the regime, engage in a multi-stage, multi-layered, significant reform of the structure of production of Turkmenistan, we will have this crisis going on for at least one more decade, up until it became thoroughly unsustainable. And we've seen that now we have, as Farruh was mentioning before, instances of poverty, of almost chronic food insecurity, which was never the case 10 years ago. So the situation is slowly deteriorating, and I don't see that things will change dramatically unless they they reform the way in which they understand the economy broadly defined.
Anyone else want to comment on sort of, any aspect of this crisis, be that the human rights dimension, the political dimension? We talked about the protests. To what extent are we seeing an unraveling of the Turkmen regime? Is that at all a possibility? If anyone wants to comment on that.
I would just say quickly that I think we have seen in other contexts that when the human rights situation, sort of an appalling human rights situation, merges with really difficult economic situation, that you start to have more people coming in. And whether this is the tipping point, whether this is, how this is going to continue, I think we need to monitor very closely. But it seems to me that the fact that people are hungry, the kinds of cases that we've heard about, points to something very different than what was going on 5 years ago. It's one thing when your NGO can't register, you can't do your work, or if you're, sort of quote unquote, not an ordinary person, you run into trouble. But when ordinary citizens can't get through the day, it changes the equation dramatically. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Farruh, any thoughts on the depth of the crisis? How unprecedented is this in recent Turkmen?
Yeah, as Luca mentioned, pointed out, Turkmenistan was already in deep economic crisis, the worst it has ever seen in the last 29 years since its independence. And of course, this COVID-19 situation significantly worsened how things stand with China, the only major buyer of Turkmen gas, said that in March it cuts 20 to 25% of its intake from Central Asia, and on that pipeline, from 50 billion cubic meters that was sent to China last year, 33 billion cubic meters were Turkmen gas. And now, as far as what we hear, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, they are discussing to share the gas supply cuts to China. So that will mean that Turkmenistan's gas exports will be cut at least by 20%, which will be very significant for the Turkmen economy. And from what we hear from our Turkmen colleagues in Turkmenistan, things with food shortage, other social provisions is worsening day by day. And Turkmen authorities are not doing them, and probably they're not doing anything because they're incapable of doing anything. They will not be able to do any reforms because it's probably a little bit too late, as given the current situation. It's not time to do reforms, and if they do the reforms, the risks are that the burden will fall on the population, and the population might not tolerate it anymore. And the things, we don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to forecast, but it's not going to get better in the nearest future, and we will see. We'll see.
Edward, one point. Whenever we have another gig going on that's called Majlis Podcast, where we discuss Central Asia every week. So whenever we have a discussion there about Turkmenistan, its economic and social conditions, we end up having kind of a depressing discussion there. Probably it's just the way it is. Maybe this question should go to Dr. Luca, because he has been part of sort of discussion we were having there. Dr. Luca, so now this is kind of a different level in terms of the economic challenges or the social challenges that Turkmenistan is facing. So what is that tipping point that we should be looking at to understand that we are getting there? And it's just that. And is there any indicator, anywhere that we should keep our eyes on to understand that things are getting there?
Well, we've been having discussions, you said, for a couple of years now. The tipping point keeps getting postponed. I think that when food insecurity becomes chronic, then when it starts to become more problematic for the regime to only survive on brutal repression and media control. But again, the resilience of the Central Asian population to this kind of authoritarian governance that they're having, it goes a long way. To me, the situation is beyond control, because I don't see any kind of government agenda to reform the economy, which means that as the model of management of these gas reserves continue to be the same, now with the international environment going into a downturn, you will have a very complex, a very difficult task in selling this gas at good price. So to me, you will have this kind of translation of energy insecurity from the regime point of view into more and more food insecurity on the population side of things, which could be the tipping point. But what I'm really worried about is that this is structural. So unless there is political will to change the economy, we will see this deprivation, food insecurity, unemployment, any kind of economic disaster going on for a long time. And as Farruh was saying before, we've seen more protests in 1 month, in the last month, that we had in the last 29 years. Well, that could be an indication that the tipping point is arriving, which it will be eventually, because I don't think that this elite is willing to change the way in which they manage the gas reserves.
We've just run out of time, but I want to thank you all for attending today. Thank you to our fantastic panelists, Farruh, Kate, and Luca, for giving us insights into a sort of little studied country. And we'll look forward to putting on more events in the future, so please join us there.